Hey, what's up, you guys? Yes, welcome to my channel or welcome back to my channel. If you haven't seen me before or you're not one of my students, I'm Ms. Parsons, and today we'll be talking about Unit 9, Day 6, Ecology, Day 6. So let's go ahead and check it out. So your handout looks like this, and today's aim is why can't a population size grow infinitely? So we're going to be looking at 3 different scenarios, and each scenario is asking the same question. So what happened to these populations? Read each passage 1 and 2 and answer the questions that follow. So before we look at what happened to these populations, let's look at this aim again. So why can't a population, so we know what this term means, right? A group of organisms of the same species, right? So why can't a group of organisms of the same species grow infinitely? And what does that word mean, infinitely? So if something goes on infinitely, right? I love you infinitely. I love you forever and ever and ever and ever. So why can't a group of organisms of the same species size grow forever and ever and ever? So why aren't there, 500 billion humans on Earth? Why isn't my house right now overrun with rats, mice, cockroaches, like all these different organisms that we see around us? Why are the population sizes finite or not infinite? Why do they stop? And we're going to be looking at factors that limit population size today. Let's start with the introduction of rabbits to Tasmania. Ooh, hold on. I think you're seeing all the answers, but we're about to talk about it. Okay. So, why can't a population size grow infinitely? The very first rabbits to arrive in Tasmania, an island off the coast of southern Australia, at the turn of the 18th century, found a vast land rich in edible plants, protective habitats, and without any natural predators. So this is the very first rabbits to arrive to Tasmania, right? Perhaps they were brought by Europeans at the turn of the 18th century. So previously, there were no rabbits in Australia. If you're a fan of Australia, you might know that there's no rabbits there because all of the mammals in Australia are marsupial, and rabbits are placental mammals. But they do have rabbits in Australia now because they were brought there at the turn of the 18th century. When they arrived, they found a vast land rich in edible plants. So what does edible plants mean? Plants they can eat, protective habitats, so shelter, and without any natural predators. The rabbit population grew rapidly as they spread across the island, consuming native grasses. So they keep spreading, right? And they have the entire continent of Australia, theoretically, where there's no other rabbits for them to compete with. Though the grasses could grow fairly quickly, in roughly 12 months, the rabbits were able to reproduce much faster. Okay, so the rabbits can reproduce every 6 months, whereas the grasses that they eat can reproduce only every 12 months. Right, so immediately we're seeing a conflict. What's that conflict? The rabbit population continued to grow exponentially for nearly 15 generations. And this term, grow exponentially, we really know what that means, right? Because we're in the middle of this COVID-19 crisis. And anytime you hear that term in math class, in science for the rest of your life, anyone who lived through this crisis, we will always remember what it means for there to be exponential growth, right? For there to have been 8 cases in New York City and 1,000 cases the next week. That's exponential, straight line up growth. And we can see that here on the graph, right? So grow exponentially until the supply of food on the island was exhausted. So if the supply of food is exhausted, what's going to happen to the rabbit population? No more food available to the rabbits, or at least not enough food to support such a large population of rabbits. until the food supply on the island was exhausted, causing many rabbits to starve to death. Why? Because we just said there was not enough food to support such a large population of rabbits. Between grass that was new and grass that was regrowing, so now we can see here, this is the point of decline on the graph, right? B. So the clearly I have rats on the mind. The rabbit population declines here because there's not enough food to support the rabbit population. Perhaps this line that has been indicated means something. This decline continued until some grasses on the island were able to regrow, right? Because that was the problem, is that the rabbits were reproducing faster than the grasses could grow. So as long as there are enough grasses, theoretically, the rabbits could continue to survive. So the population declined until it was small enough that they could be supported by the grasses and could once again sustain more rabbits. Between grass that was new and grass which was regrowing, there was always enough grass for roughly 500,000, and we can see that number here, 500,000, for roughly 500,000 rabbits. The population continued to oscillate, so we can see that here, increase and decrease, slightly over time, right here. Increase, little decrease until it gets below 500,000, little increase above 500,000 again, little decrease below 500,000. So this number is the number of rabbits that could be supported by this area in Australia. The carrying capacity of this island of Australia for rabbits is 500,000. 500,000 rabbits could be supported by this environment. Carrying capacity, a new vocabulary word, or I guess phrase. But remained fairly constant around 500,000 individuals. So now the question, what is the maximum number of rabbits this ecosystem can stably support? So remember, we can have slightly over 500,000 rabbits, but what do we see that happens every time the number of rabbits gets over 500,000? It has to decline because the rabbits cannot be stably supported above that number. So the maximum number of rabbits this ecosystem can stably support is 500,000. What factor limited how large the rabbit population could get? So if we go back to the text here, we'll remember that the rabbits initially found Australia rich in edible plants and protective habitats. However, they quickly began consuming native grasses at a rate faster than the grasses themselves could regrow or reproduce. So what factor limited how large the population could get? Food supply. Food supply and the actual food itself, the grass and its growth period, right? So it specifically says in the text, the grasses grow every 12 months, but the rabbits' reproduction cycle every 6 months is too fast for the grasses to support this population over 500,000. So now this is that vocabulary word. So carrying capacity means the number of organisms that could be carried or supported by this environment. So in this case, what is the carrying capacity of this population? We already said it, 500,000. And what type of growth occurred at point A on the graph? So again, we're experts in this type of growth because we're living through it right now, folks. Continued to grow exponentially for nearly 15 generations. And you can see that here, right? So this is to generation 1, over here is to generation 15. So they're telling us this is exponential growth for nearly 15 generations until we hit that carrying capacity. Okay. So now this is a very similar concept, or excuse me, a very similar story on the same concept, but this time talking about wolverines and territory size. Wolverines are small carnivorous animals related to weasels. Wolverines are known to be able to eat many different animals and usually do not have difficulty finding food. However, they are fiercely territorial and require large tracts of land for their territories. It's a Monty Python reference, guys. I don't know who wrote this, but whoever did, that was a deliberate Monty Python reference. If any of you got that reference, you're cool. If they do not maintain these large territories, they risk competing over living space, food, mates, or water. Okay, so here's what we know. The wolverines, they're small carnivorous animals. They can eat pretty much anything. That's not their problem. Their problem is they're very territorial. So they need a large amount of space to survive. So If they do not maintain these large territories, they risk competing with other wolverines over living space, food, mates, or water. A large earthquake in northern Canada isolated a population of roughly 15 wolverines in a large forest. The wolverine population grew very rapidly until they had exceeded the number that could live in the space of the forest. At that point, competition between wolverines whose territories overlapped caused the wolverine population to decline. So, as we can see here, a population of roughly 15 wolverines were isolated in a large forest. The population then grew very rapidly because they had previously been part of a larger population of wolverines. Now they're isolated, so they're all just reproducing with each other, and the population of wolverines is increasing in this forest until they exceed the number that could live in the space of the forest. So then until they exceed the carrying capacity of that forest. And again, let's think back to the scenario with the rabbits. The limiting factor for the rabbits was food supply. In this case, what's the limiting factor for these wolverines? Land or territory size, right? Because what it says here, what caused the population of wolverines to decline? Competition between wolverines, right? So they were competing. There wasn't enough food, water, or maybe they're competing for a mate and killing each other. At that point, competition between wolverines whose territories overlapped caused the wolverine population to decline. So we can see here exponential growth after the wolverines are separated. So that's here indicated by A. At point B, they've reached the carrying capacity of the forest and the population has begun to decline. The increased amount of available space and the wolverine population, this increased the amount of available space. So dark, but what is it that increased the amount of available space? Death of wolverines. And the wolverine population was able to rebound. So you can see, maybe at this point here, it stabilizes. The cycle continued with the population stabilizing around 80 wolverines. And we can see that here. And this looks like sort of the end of our rabbit chart when the population has found a number that can be supported by the environment, right? And what do we call that term? Carrying capacity. So it looks like the carrying capacity for this forest is around 80 wolverines. So what is the carrying capacity for wolverines in this ecosystem? 80. And how about what factor limited how large the wolverine population could get? Territory size. Was this a density dependent or density independent factor? Well, we did not get, no, this is density dependent, forgive me. So in particular, what they're telling us the issue here is the number of wolverines in a small territory. In the example with the rabbits, it did not describe a specific area and instead seemed to be talking about rabbits all over all of the island of Australia, which is obviously very large. In this case, we're talking about a small forest and the density is a major factor. Why? Because competition between wolverines is the issue. Remember, in the rabbit example, they were not competing over grasses. It was rather that the grasses simply could not grow fast enough to support such a large rabbit population. In this case, if the wolverines were able to spread out, if they were not isolated in this area of the forest due to a large earthquake, they would be able to spread out more. So this is a density dependent issue. The wolverines could spread out more had they not been isolated by this event, this earthquake. In the examples above, both species were said to have reached the carrying capacity of their environments. After some time, using the information contained in both passages, as well as the population graphs provided, brainstorm a definition for the term carrying capacity. So we've been talking about this now for both scenarios. I encourage you to come up with your own definition for carrying capacity. Going back through these scenarios after we just did them, so that way you understand, but let's just sort of simply say the carrying capacity, hold on, one more time. Carrying capacity of organisms a population that can be supported by the given environment. And let's add some words. Maximum stable number of organisms in a population that can be supported by about their environment. So this is obviously an ecology term in this ecology unit. And in the case of carrying capacity, we are typically talking obviously about organisms that human beings have interacted with because we do need quite a bit of data about their lifestyle in order to calculate this carrying capacity. And as you can see in both examples with the rabbits and the wolverines, a lot of this data, and we'll see this in the ecology unit as we go on. And also if you think back to the spread of diseases lab, a lot of this is historical data. So we're digging through a lot of data that was gathered by scientists in the field, which is really interesting, and especially to those of you who may want to work in science as your professional career. If you like nature and like animals, ecology is a pretty cool field to do research in. All right, let's go on. So part A, limiting factors. So the carrying capacity is affected by these limiting factors. And what are they? And this term you may remember: changing constant, dynamic equilibrium. So limiting factors determine the population size or carrying capacity in an ecosystem, right? So we have a lake. Let's say I have a pond, okay? So it's very small body of water, but it's large enough that it has an ecosystem. And in that pond, it's a man-made pond. Say I dug this pond myself. And I filled it with some different types of fish, but I only put a few of each different species of fish, right? And I made sure that they were fish that could live together in a pond. But eventually, the number of fish will stabilize because the amount of food and water and space that is available in that pond is finite, right? So a limiting factor in that case is the pond that I dug, right? So I created that limiting factor, and based on the size of that pond and then the other things, the other biotic and abiotic factors of that pond, the maximum population size or carrying capacity is determined. Different population or different environments can have different limiting factors. Limiting factors cause a given population to remain stable in a habitat. So the population is not going to skyrocket and skyrocket, skyrocket forever. It cannot increase infinitely because there are limiting factors. Limiting factors include overhunting. So obviously humans have overhunted many species for our own use usually, but also, for sport, which is horrifying. Disease, and disease can affect animals and plants, right? Especially if you guys read science news, you may have heard about Cavendish bananas and banana blight. So because all the bananas on Earth are like the same species of bananas, they're a clone of each other. It's a major concern that if there was to be some sort of disease that affected even just one banana tree group, it could affect all the banana trees all over the world, and it could wipe out all bananas, which obviously humans eat a lot of bananas. But in any environment, disease could be a limiting factor. Sunlight, so the amount of sunlight, right? Certain plants can't grow in environments where there's too little or too much sunlight. If a tree, let's say, keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger over 100 years, and then all of a sudden it has a canopy, plants that may have lived at the base of that tree that used to get enough sunlight may die. So that limiting factors can change over time, right? Just like environments can change over time. Predator to prey ratio. And again, this is part of why we're talking about the dynamic equilibrium here. In order to maintain the homeostasis or the carrying capacity of the environment, just like in our bodies, there's little changes. We get a little bit hotter and a little bit cooler. If it gets too hot, we take our sweater off. If it gets too cold, we put it back on. This is sort of the environment correcting itself, right? There's flood that wipes out some organisms, but then they're able to rebound because there's less competition for resources, right? The environment is constantly trying to stabilize. However, there are all kinds of things changing all the time. Okay, so sorry. A little bit maybe philosophical for our ecology lecture. So food, water, and shelter obviously could be limiting factors in any environment, of course, and weather. And remember, these things can change and evolve over time, and certain scenarios, like thinking back to the Wolverine example, an earthquake, some major weather event can completely transform an environment and thus can completely transform the populations that are in that environment. All right, so limiting factors practice. An environment can support only as many organisms as the available energy, minerals, and oxygen will allow. Which term is best described by this statement? Is it homeostatic control? So we were just relating that to homeostasis, but have we ever heard that term before? Carrying capacity? That sounds like a term we've heard before. Biological feedback? That sounds like a term from Unit 5. Biological diversity? Well, we're in the right unit, but I don't think that's what we're talking about here. So an environment can only support as many organisms as the available energy, minerals, and oxygen will allow, and that's, wow, the audacity. That's carrying capacity, but these arrows appear to be in the wrong order. So let's go ahead and read this question. Oh, wow, okay. A pond ecosystem is shown in the diagram below. So we can see here the food web, the green-backed heron is eating the frog is eating the water boatman, the catfish is also eating the water boatman, green-backed heron is eating the catfish, the rotifers are being eaten by the water fleas are being eaten by the catfish, the water fleas are eating the algae, the rotifers, which look like some sort of plants, and mosquito larvae are eating the algae, and the mosquito larvae are being eaten by the water boatman. So we can see the relationships in this food web, right? And forgive me for going through all of those relationships, but you are definitely going to be seeing more food webs, and I'm sure you've already seen food webs in this unit. So, which statement describes an interaction that helps maintain the dynamic equilibrium of this ecosystem? The frogs make energy available to this ecosystem through the process of photosynthesis. Are frogs autotrophs? Based on this chart alone, we can see that they're eating something. So no, frogs are not autotrophs. The algae directly provide food for both the rotifers and the catfish. So we can see that the algae are eaten by the rotifers, but it does not show a direct relationship between the algae and the catfish. So that is not there. The green-backed heron provides energy for the mosquito larvae. So no, that's not the direction that relationship is going in. Or the catfish population helps control the populations of water boatmen and water fleas. So we can see there that the catfish are eating the water boatmen and the catfish are eating the water fleas. And perhaps those two organisms that are also being eaten by other organisms would grow unchecked, was it not for the predator-prey relationship, which we saw can be a limiting factor in the previous slide. So the answer is D. The catfish population helps control the populations of water boatmen and water fleas. Those natural predator-prey relationships in an ecosystem help maintain dynamic equilibrium. Which statement best explains section X of the graph? Ooh, this looks familiar. The graph below shows the number of birds in a population. So, new birds introduced to this population, maybe, let's tie in an example from evolution, because that's my favorite unit. So, these are some finches. They just got blown onto a different island in the Galapagos by a big windstorm. So, they're migrating, they get blown over. So now they're the brand new finches, no other finches there to compete with them. The population starts growing exponentially, so many finches, so little time, so much finch. And then they've reached this point. This point here where the population seems to have hit its maximum and cannot continue to be supported beyond that number. After that, it appears to go down a little bit and up, and it is stabilizing. Hint, hint. So which statement best describes section X of the graph? So if you didn't get it when we were going through the chart, this point here, right before section F, is the carrying capacity, right? The maximum number of birds that can be supported in this environment. And then in section X, we're looking at A, interbreeding between members of this population increased the mutation rate. No, that is not at all related to this. An increase in the bird population caused an increase in the producer population. Well, that might be true, but there's no information about that on this graph. The population has reached a state of dynamic equilibrium due to limiting factors. Oh, that sounds more in the ballpark. Or another species came to the area and provided food for the birds. So if perhaps that was true, we might see an increase, a further increase in the bird population, which we don't see, right? The carrying capacity didn't change. And instead, what's happening is the population reached a state of dynamic equilibrium due to limiting factors. So they reach the carrying capacity due to limiting factors, whatever it is. It could have been food supply, territory. We don't have those details. But after that point, the bird population begins to stabilize. And it might increase a little bit and decrease a little bit, but it'll hover around that number. And that number is what we call the carrying capacity. One biotic factor that limits the carrying capacity of any habitat is the availability of water, the level of atmospheric oxygen, the activity of decomposers, or the amount of soil erosion. So the key word in this question is a biotic factor. So which one of these is a biotic factor? Is water biotic? Is oxygen biotic? Are decomposers biotic? Is the amount of soil erosion biotic? So our answer could only be C. But that question could trick you because if you read it, you're like, oh my God, all of those could limit the carrying capacity. What? But it's a biotic factor. An environment can support only as many organisms as the available energy, minerals, and oxygen will allow. It's almost like we read this question. Which term is best described by this statement? It's carrying capacity, folks. All right, so let's go on. Okay. Part B, limiting factors practice. The graph below shows the growth of population of bacteria over 80 hours. Which statement best describes section 2 of the graph? The population has reached the carrying capacity of the environment. So this is section 2. The rate of reproduction is slower than in section 1. That doesn't appear to be the case to me, right? The slope of the line is straighter, so it's rising faster, right? Rise over run? Algebra kids, tell me. Okay, sorry. The population is greater than the carrying capacity in the environment. Not yet. The rate of reproduction exceeds the death rate. So growth of a population of bacteria. Okay, so this is giving us overall growth, not just numbers of new organisms, but it's subtracting the death rate from the population. So, so forgive me, ladies and gentlemen, but I just read that question like 4 times. So I do feel like this, and I've seen it before, believe it or not. So I do feel like perhaps I should explain it to you. So, which statement best describes section 2 of the graph? We can see section 2 here, and we can see the absolute growth of the population of bacteria. Always read your titles, ladies and gentlemen, is higher than at a previous point in the graph, right? And we can see actually that in section 2, the growth is the most rapidly increasing at this point, right? The slope is the steepest here, steeper than here, steeper than here, steeper than this point in the graph as well. So the rate of reproduction exceeds the death rate, because at this point, it doesn't look like we've reached the carrying capacity of the environment, right? This graph might go on a little bit longer and reach that carrying capacity number, but it doesn't appear to have done so yet, especially not in section 2 of the graph, right? You might say that maybe up here. The rate of reproduction is slower than in section 1. Again, that's not true. We can see that the slope of the line in section 2 is higher, indicating that there is more rapid reproduction. And the population is greater than the carrying capacity of the environment. So far we don't see evidence of that. We're not seeing any steep declines in the bacteria population yet. But the rate of reproduction exceeds the death rate. That one is true. So now draw a population line on the graph below showing what might happen if a population passes its carrying capacity. All right, so exponential growth. Oh no, we passed the carrying capacity. We passed it a little bit further and then we die. And then we go below the number and then we increase again just a little bit. And oh no, there's too many of us. Limiting factors send us back down. But then now we keep reproducing because we're living life. And then, oh no, there's not enough food. We go down. And then we're living life and now we stabilize. And your graph should look something like that. Yeah, something like that, right? So increase, and we call this section of the line the exponential growth because it's exponentially increasing before we interact with any limiting factors. And this dotted line right here represents the carrying capacity, right? So you see we exceed that on the first pass, but then the population significantly declines, and then it rebounds a little bit back to that carrying capacity. And, you know, the trend can look a little bit more dramatic and up and down, but it's going to hover around that number because that's the maximum number of individuals that can be supported by the environmental conditions where they live. And all right, limiting factors practice. Identify one abiotic factor in the diagram that functions as a limiting factor for the autotrophs in this ecosystem, and explain why it would be considered a limiting factor and what kind of limiting factor it is. So, what is one abiotic factor? Well, what's labeled in this diagram? We have hawk, he's alive. We have this grasshopper, she's alive, she's chilling. We have this fish, they're alive, they're living their best life. And then we have light. The only thing that I see that's abiotic that's labeled is light. Light functions as a limiting factor for autotrophs in this ecosystem. Do you guys remember this example from much earlier in the year? Why would light be a limiting factor for autotrophs? Autotrophs, and we can see here in the diagram, are not able to grow at the bottom of the pond due to inability to complete photosynthesis. Sorry, I'm like, how do I say that? Inability to complete photosynthesis without enough sunlight. This is density independent. Independent. So this is density independent. Why? Because unlike the number of wolverines that need large tracts of land, in this case, it doesn't matter. Not a one plant could live at the bottom of this pond. Why? Because there's not enough light down there for any plants. Okay? So identify one abiotic factor in the diagram that functions as a limiting factor for the autotrophs in this ecosystem, and explain why it would be considered a limiting factor and what kind of limiting factor it is. Light functions as a limiting factor for autotrophs in this ecosystem. Autotrophs are not able to grow at the bottom of the pond due to inability to complete photosynthesis without enough sunlight. So the sunlight can't penetrate to the bottom of the pond, and we can see this, right? There are some autotrophs living on the banks of the pond, but at the deepest point here, there's no life because there's not enough sunlight that reaches the bottom of the pond. And that does not allow the plants to survive because they need to make their own glucose. They need to complete photosynthesis. And this is density independent because, again, it's not like the pond can only support so many plants at the bottom. This is a case where not enough sunlight hits, no plants are there. Okay, 10 breeding pairs of rabbits are introduced onto an island with no natural predators and a good supply of water and food. Describe what will most likely happen to the rabbit population over the next 100 years, assuming no natural disasters occur on the island. What will some of the limiting factors be? So even though they have a good supply of water and food, right? Water, food, and land size will become limiting factors over time for the rabbits. At first, and think back to the graphs we looked at, population size will increase exponentially. Then, once the rabbit population reaches the, forgive me, ladies and gentlemen. Oh, no good. Haha. Forgive my technical difficulties. Okay. Once the rabbit population reaches the island's carrying capacity, population decrease and eventually stabilize. Competition for mates may also be a limit. No, I mean, it could be, but probably not. Okay, so 10 breeding pairs of rabbits are introduced onto an island with no natural predators and a good supply of water and food. Describe what will most likely happen to the rabbit population over the next 100 years, assuming no natural disasters occur on the island. What will some of the limiting factors be? Water, food, and land size will become limiting factors over time for the rabbits, right? It's a finite size of land, it's an island. At first, the rabbit population size will increase exponentially, right, that we saw in our graph. Then once the rabbit population reaches the island's carrying capacity, so the maximum amount of rabbits that can be supported by the food and water available, the size of land, the rabbit population will decrease and then eventually stabilize, right, that we saw that trend several times. And part C now, limiting factors, independent practice. The diagram below represents the growth of the population of wolves in an ecosystem. On which day did the population represented in the graph above reach the carrying capacity of the ecosystem? So when does the population stop increasing? And it looks like right here at day 8. And how do we know? Well, after day 8, that definitely doesn't really increase anymore. And every increase is followed by a decline, right? So it's the stop of the exponential growth. And after that point, the population size, if it increases, decreases right after. So on approximately day 8, reached carrying capacity. I know this because, well, this is evident because it is the end of the exponential increase of population. And after day 8, if the population increases, it decreases right after. What is one density independent limiting factor that could affect the wolf population? So density independent, I mean amount of sunlight, atmospheric oxygen, weather, let's say weather, but all of those would work, right? So any factor that would impact all wolves living in that area, that wouldn't be worse because there's more wolves, right? So density independent is not affected by the density of the population, by the number of organisms. What is one, for example, a forest fire is a density independent limiting factor. A natural disaster is density independent. Compared to something density dependent, how about food supply? Available prey. Now, in the case of something like those rabbits, in our first scenario, the amount of grass was, in that scenario, depicted as density independent because it was the rate of reproduction of the rabbits that was too fast for the grasses to match. However, if you have rabbits in a pen and you only give them, a pound of hay per day, and you continue to let the rabbits reproduce, which this would be a very cruel experiment. But in that case, right, that hay would be a density dependent limiting factor, in that your rabbits will be able to survive there just fine on that 1 pound of hay until it's too many rabbits for 1 pound of hay. And then all of a sudden the rabbits start eating each other and you have rabbit Mad Max on your hands. And oh my God, what a horrible, horrible example. Let's get out of this handout. We're almost done, folks. All right, now I had predator and prey on the brain. Below is a graph showing the relationship between a predator, the lynx, and its prey, a hare. Study the graph and then answer the questions that follow. So we're looking at the predator-prey relationships in lynx, effect of lynx predation on hares. So predator-prey relationship between the lynx, the predator, and the hare, the prey. So in 1910, there's a lot of hares. All right, there's a lot of them. Their population increases. Not coincidentally, the lynx population also increases after because they're eating those hares. Seems like maybe the lynx ate a lot of hares because the hare population starts to really take a nosedive here. And as the hare population is nosediving, the lynx population surpasses the hares, okay? But the hare population is still declining, so the lynx don't go up for long. They take a significant dip, okay? And that dip in the lynx population, and forgive me, I'm analyzing this sort of as we're looking at it, that dip in the lynx population was enough to allow the hare population to make a resurgence, right? Because the lynx are eating the hares, there's almost no lynx here, the hares are coming back with a vengeance, hitting, again, almost the same number from the beginning, around about 50,000 hares. At that point, the lynx population is coming back. They've got hares to eat. The lynx population gets close to this number that it hit over here in the 1911, 12, 13, somewhere around 1914, somewhere around World War I. It's about 30,000 lynx, and it gets close to that number again here, but it does decline again. And we can see sort of matching the same pattern from earlier, just a little bit lower numbers of lynx and hares in the 1930s. Okay, so what is the dependent variable? What is the dependent variable here? What is the independent variable? Oh, Lord. And what can you infer about predator-prey relationships from this graph? So the dependent variable is the number in thousands of hare and lynx. The independent variable is the number of years. Oops, sorry. So the dependent variable is number in thousands of lynx hares. What is the independent variable? Years. And what can we infer? Well, availability of prey, hares, significantly impacted the lynx population. Predator and prey seem to have an interlocked relationship ecologically, one dependent on the other. And, I mean, we can see here, too, that the hares, if the hare population increases too much, the predation by the lynx is an important limiting factor for the hares, right? If the hare population gets above this number, this 50,000, that could be the carrying capacity of hares for the environment. And once it gets past that number, life for the hares is probably not so nice, right? There's not enough food for them to eat. So at that point, they become the prey of the lynx. But of course, that's perhaps a predator-centric viewpoint, and it's no coincidence that humans would have a predator-centric viewpoint. I wouldn't necessarily call us predators, but we're definitely predators more so than prey. Okay, I believe that is the end of day 6. It is. All right, ladies and gentlemen, well, I hope you enjoyed that video. I certainly did. We do miss you all. I, for one, can't believe it's the end of May already. Wow, all right, so thank you for coming. Please make sure you hit that little bell, like and subscribe to my channel, and come back for a new video. I'll be doing day 7 as well. So I'll see you guys very soon. Bye-bye.